$50 million had turned to ash in the air. The scent of its burning was acrid, a mix of panic and overpriced steak. In the hushed, velvet-draped private room of Aurelian, a restaurant so exclusive it didn't have a sign, the silence was a sickness. Marcus Thorne, a man whose ambition was eclipsed only by the garishness of his gold watch, felt the sickness in his gut. His face, usually a mask of smug certainty, was slick with a sheen of desperate sweat. The deal, a landmark acquisition that would have catapulted his firm into the stratosphere, was irrevocably dead. It was dying right here, on a table set with silver that cost more than a car, under a chandelier that glittered like a spilled jewelry box. Across from him, Mr. Kwan sat with the stillness of a predator. He was a man carved from granite and discipline, his suit a whisper of dark, tailored perfection. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't needed to. His displeasure was an atmospheric pressure drop, a physical weight in the room. Beside him, his own translator, a nervous young man, fumbled with his notes, his face pale. Every word Mr. Kwan spoke in his native tongue was a low, guttural judgment, and every clumsy translation that fell from the young man's lips seemed to drain more life from the deal. He says the terms are not favorable, the translator stammered, which was like saying a tsunami was a bit of weather. Marcus slammed a fist on the table, making the water glasses tremble. Not favorable? We offered $10 million over market. What does he want? Tell him this is the best offer he'll ever see. His two sycophantic lieutenants, flanking him like nervous gargoyles, nodded in vigorous, mindless agreement. Unseen, unheard, Zola moved at the edge of the room, a ghost in a crisp black apron. To them, she was furniture that moved, a pair of hands that refilled water glasses and cleared away the debris of their failure. She placed a fresh bottle of sparkling water on the table with a silent, practiced grace, her movements fluid and economical. Her face was a mask of professional neutrality, but her eyes, deep and observant, missed nothing. She saw the tremor in Marcus's hand as he reached for his glass. She saw the contempt in Mr. Kwan's gaze, not just for Marcus, but for the translator who butchered his language, who filed down the sharp edges of his words into dull, meaningless pebbles. Zola knew that the issue wasn't the $50 million. It was the insult. It was the profound, grating disrespect Marcus showed, treating this negotiation like a back-alley haggle for cheap goods. She continued her silent circuit, her presence as unobtrusive as the air conditioning's hum, a silent witness to the collapse. Mr. Kwan spoke again. It was a final, dismissive sentence, sharp and cold as breaking ice. He pushed his chair back slightly, a clear signal that the evening and the $50 million opportunity was over. The young translator swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He turned to Marcus, his eyes wide with fear. "Mr. Kwan thanks you for the meal," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He says perhaps another time." It was a catastrophic mistranslation, a pathetic attempt to soften a fatal blow. Marcus Thorne, hearing only the weak, placating words, scoffed. He saw it as a negotiation tactic, a final bit of posturing. Another time? Tell him there won't be another time. This is it. He leaned back, attempting a smirk that looked more like a grimace. But Zola had heard the real words. She had heard the surgical precision of the insult Mr. Kwan had delivered. She was clearing away a bread plate near Marcus's elbow, her hand poised to lift the fine china. The original words echoed in her mind, not a polite refusal, but a curse on Marcus's lineage, a declaration that a man who shows such disrespect to his elders and his history is not a man worth doing business with, but a hollow vessel, a ghost chasing paper. The dissonance between the truth and the lie that hung in the air was too great. A line was being crossed, not just of business, but of dignity. As Marcus began to rise, full of bluster and false confidence, Zola set the plate down. The gentle clink of ceramic on linen was as loud as a gunshot in the suddenly silent room. Every head turned. She didn't look at Marcus. She looked directly at Mr. Kwan, whose cold eyes widened fractionally in surprise. Then she spoke. Her voice was calm, low, and perfectly clear, and she spoke in Korean, the formal, honorific dialect reserved for elders and esteemed figures. "He did not say he thanks you for the meal," she began, her gaze still locked with Mr. Kwan's, "and he did not say, perhaps another time." She then repeated Mr. Kwan's exact scathing words, her pronunciation flawless, her tone imbued with the precise weight of their meaning. The air left the room. The translator looked as if he'd been struck. Marcus Thorne froze mid-motion, his mouth hanging open, his arrogant smirk melting into a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. In that moment, Zola was no longer a waitress. She was the only person in the room who held the truth. The power in the room, once pooled entirely around Marcus Thorne and his pile of money, did not just shift. It evaporated from his side of the table and recondensed around Zola. She stood there, a simple black apron tied around her waist, holding the weight of a $50 million negotiation in the palm of her hand. Mr. Kwan, who had been halfway out of his seat, slowly sank back down. He studied her, his head tilted. The mask of cold indifference was gone, replaced by an incandescent curiosity. A slow, dangerous smile touched the corners of his lips. He ignored everyone else and spoke directly to her, a stream of rapid, complex Korean. It wasn't a question about the menu. It was a test, a challenge. Marcus, utterly lost, began to panic. The foundation of his world, that money and volume equated to control, was crumbling. "What? What is he saying? What did you say to him?" he sputtered, his voice cracking. He looked from Mr. Kwan's smiling face to Zola's calm one, a man drowning between two shores. Zola listened intently to Mr. Kwan, her expression unchanging. She gave a slight, respectful bow of her head before turning her attention to Marcus. The subservience of her previous posture was gone, replaced by an unyielding dignity. Her spine was straight, her gaze direct. "Mr. Kwan asked how a woman like me came to be serving water in a place like this, when my understanding of his heart seems to exceed that of the man paid to interpret his words." She delivered the line without inflection, a simple statement of fact that was also a devastating indictment. The hired translator flinched, shrinking in his chair. Marcus's face cycled through a series of emotions, confusion, then anger, then a dawning, horrified realization. He was no longer in charge. The waitress, the invisible woman he had dismissed with a wave of his hand, was now the gatekeeper. "Listen," he tried, changing tactics, attempting to draw her into his circle of transactional charm. "I don't know who you are, but you've got a good ear. Help me close this. There's a big bonus in it for you." A huge one. Zola's eyes met his, and for the first time he saw the steel behind them. "My name is Zola," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "and I am not for hire." She then turned back to Mr. Kwan, switching back to Korean as smoothly as drawing a breath, leaving Marcus Thorne utterly alone in a conversation he could no longer comprehend or control. The balance had irrevocably tipped. The negotiation was reborn, phoenix-like, from the ashes of Marcus's arrogance, but it was a different beast entirely. It was no longer a conversation between two principals, but a tribunal refereed by an unlikely judge in a server's apron. Zola stood at the head of the table, a still point in a swirling storm of commerce and culture. Mr. Kwan now directed all his statements to her, his tone respectful, his language rich with idiomatic expressions and cultural subtext that would have been utterly lost on the previous translator. He laid out new terms, not of money, but of principle. He spoke of legacy, of the company his grandfather had built from the rubble of war, and how any partner must understand that they were not buying assets, but becoming custodians of a history. It was a lecture, a test, and a new offer all in one. Zola processed it all, her mind a swift and silent engine of translation. When she turned to Marcus, her English was precise, clinical, and stripped of all ambiguity. Mr. Kwan is willing to reconsider, she stated, her voice cutting through the tense air. However, the valuation is no longer the primary issue. He requires a public statement of partnership drafted by his council that acknowledges the founding principles of his family's enterprise. He also requires 2 seats on your board to be held by his sons to ensure those principles are respected. Marcus's jaw worked silently. This was more than he had bargained for. It was a surrender of control, a public genuflection. That's insane, one of his lieutenants muttered, only to be silenced by a venomous glare from Marcus. He saw the deal, his singular triumph slipping away again. He looked at Zola, trying to find an ally. Sweetheart, tell him that's a non-starter. We can talk about 1 seat, maybe. An advisory role. Zola didn't even blink. She translated his weak counteroffer into polite but firm Korean. Mr. Kwan listened, then responded with a single sharp sentence. Zola turned back to Marcus. Mr. Kwan says that a man who sends a servant to bargain for him is not a man who deserves a seat at the table at all. The offer is his, or it is nothing. The finality of it hung in the air. The choice was clear, humiliation and success, or pride and failure. Marcus Thorne, a man who had built his empire on bluster, was finally, truly speechless. His fate rested in the hands of the woman he hadn't even deemed worthy of a glance an hour before. As Zola stood there, the conduit between 2 worlds, the scent of the seared steak and expensive wine in the room seemed to fade, replaced by a ghost of something else, kimchi and rain-slicked asphalt, the low hum of soul at dusk. A memory, sharp and vivid, rose in her mind, unbidden. She was 12 years old, standing beside her father in a soaring glass boardroom overlooking the Han River. Her father, Amari, was a diplomat, an ambassador from a proud but small African nation, a man of profound intelligence and quiet dignity. He wore his integrity like a well-tailored suit, but in that room, filled with powerful, dismissive men who looked right through him, it felt like armor made of glass. He was negotiating a trade agreement, a pact that would bring vital medical supplies to his country. He spoke flawless English. His arguments were impeccable, his logic unassailable. But the Korean minister he was speaking to, a man much like Marcus Thorne in spirit, only listened with half an ear, making condescending jokes to his aides in their native tongue. They assumed the little African girl at her father's side was just a curiosity, a doll-like attachment. They didn't know she was a sponge, soaking up every word, every subtle inflection of disrespect. She had spent 5 years in Seoul, attending a local school, her young mind eagerly mapping the complex terrain of the language and its deep cultural grammar. That night, after the disastrous meeting, her father had sat with her. He wasn't angry, he was weary. "They did not hear my words, Zola," he had told her, his voice heavy with a sadness that she was only just beginning to understand. because I was not speaking their language. She had been confused. But you were, Papa. You speak better English than they do. He had shaken his head, a gentle, tired smile on his face. No, not the language of the heart, the language of honor, of history, of shared struggle. To them, I am an outsider asking for a favor. To truly be heard, you must show them you understand who they are, where they come from. Language is more than words. It is a key, and without the right key, the most important doors will always remain locked. In that moment, her father had given her a mission. She devoured the language, not just from textbooks, but from poetry, from historical texts, from conversations with the old women selling spices in the Gwangjang market. She learned the proverbs. She learned the precise weight of family, of face, of a debt that can never be repaid. She was learning the language of her father's ghost, the key he never had the chance to fully forge. And now, standing in this restaurant, facing a man of quiet power and another of hollow noise, she understood. This wasn't about a deal. This was about unlocking a door. This was for him. The memory was a ghost, but its weight was real. It settled on Zola's shoulders, not as a burden, but as a mantle of purpose. The face of her father, weary but resolute, swam in her vision. She was no longer a 12-year-old girl watching helplessly. She was his instrument of vindication. The air in the room was brittle, ready to shatter. Marcus Thorne was a man walking on a tightrope over a canyon of his own making, and Zola had just set the rope on fire. He stared at her, his face a canvas of disbelief and fury. The world had inverted. The servant was giving orders, the master was begging for scraps. "This is absurd," he finally choked out, turning his desperate gaze back to Mr. Kwan, as if appealing to a long-lost sense of male solidarity. "We had a deal. A number. We can go back to that number." Zola translated his plea without softening its pathetic edge. "Mr. Kwan listened, his expression unreadable, then replied with a calm, deliberate phrase. "Mr. Kwan acknowledges that you had a number," Zola relayed, her voice a placid sea over the turbulent depths of the conversation. "He says it was the number of a man buying a thing. He is no longer interested in selling a thing. He is interested in building a future, and the price for that is respect. His terms are the only terms." Marcus's lieutenants were shifting nervously, their loyalty to their boss warring with their primal instinct for self-preservation. They could see the power had left him. It was like watching a king be stripped of his robes in the middle of his court. Marcus made one last, desperate gambit. He looked at Zola, his eyes trying to convey a sincerity he did not possess. "Listen, Zola, $1 million, right now. In your account tomorrow. Just make this work. Smooth it over. Tell him whatever he wants to hear." The offer was obscene, a clumsy fistful of cash meant to buy her soul. Zola felt a flicker of pity for him, for his utter, profound ignorance. He still thought the key to every door was made of gold. She gave the slightest shake of her head. "You are still trying to buy the lock, Mr. Thorne. You don't understand. The key was never for sale." She then turned to Mr. Kwan and explained in fluid Korean the bribe that had just been offered. A slow, cold anger finally bloomed in Mr. Kwan's eyes. He stood up, his movement decisive. The negotiation was over, but Zola held up a single hand, a gesture of profound authority that stopped him in his tracks. She looked at Marcus, her gaze unwavering. "Accept his terms, now, or he walks." Marcus Thorne looked at the abyss and blinked. The fall would be catastrophic, not just the 50 million, but the prestige, the victory, the headline in the financial papers that he had already written in his head. His legacy would be a footnote about a deal that died on the vine because of his own hubris. He looked at Zola, this impossible woman who had appeared from the background scenery to become the arbiter of his fate. He hated her. He hated her with a white-hot intensity, for her calmness, for her command, for the way Mr. Kwan looked at her with an admiration he had never and would never receive. But more than he hated her, he feared failure. His entire identity was built on the scaffolding of success, and without it, he was nothing but a loud man with an expensive watch. He finally crumpled. The fight went out of him, leaving a hollowed-out shell. "Fine," he whispered, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. "His terms. We accept his terms." The words were an unconditional surrender. Zola nodded once, a crisp final gesture. She turned to Mr. Kwan and conveyed the acceptance, her voice formal and devoid of triumph. Mr. Kwan listened, his gaze still fixed on Marcus, ensuring he saw the full depth of his capitulation. Then he spoke, not to Marcus, but to Zola. His tone was different now. The coldness was gone, replaced by a warmth that was almost startling. He gestured to the chair beside him. Zola translated for the room. "Mr. Kwan has accepted your surrender," she said, her eyes on Marcus. "He suggests your legal teams be in contact in the morning to finalize the language of the agreement. He considers your part in this evening's proceedings to be concluded." It was a dismissal of breathtaking finality. Marcus and his two stunned acolytes were being sent away from the table like children. There was a beat of stunned silence. Then Marcus, his face ashen, pushed his chair back and stood on unsteady legs. He didn't say another word. He couldn't. He walked out of the room, followed by his shadows, a defeated general leaving the field. The heavy door clicked shut behind them, and in the sudden, profound quiet, Mr. Kwan looked at Zola, who was still standing, and said in his own language, "Now, Zola, please sit. Tell me who you are." The air in the room transformed. The oppressive tension of the failed negotiation bled away, replaced by a quiet, vibrating curiosity. Zola remained standing for a moment, the muscle memory of her job warring with the new reality of her situation. She was no longer the help. She was the guest of honor. Slowly, she moved to the chair Mr. Kwan had indicated, the one directly across from him, and sat. The velvet was soft, a world away from the hard stools in the staff break room. Mr. Kwan, whose name she learned was Jinwoo, poured her a glass of water himself, the gesture freighted with significance. It was an act of service, a reversal of roles that cemented the new dynamic between them. He didn't press her for answers immediately. Instead, he spoke of his grandfather, the man who had founded the company. He painted a picture of a man who believed a person's word was a sacred bond, and that business was not about transactions, but about relationships built on mutual honor. He explained that Marcus Thorne's disrespect wasn't a personal affront to him, but a desecration of his grandfather's memory. As he spoke, Zola listened, and she understood. He was not just explaining his actions. He was showing her the contents of his own heart, offering her the key to his own locked door. He was showing her that he was not like Marcus Thorne. When he finally fell silent, he looked at her expectantly. "Your father was not a businessman," he stated, not as a question, but as a certainty. "He was a scholar, or a diplomat." Zola felt a lump form in her throat. She nodded, her composure wavering for the first time. "A diplomat," she confirmed, her voice soft. He believed that understanding was the most powerful currency in the world. And so she told him. She told him about her childhood and soul, about her father's quiet strength and the painful memory of that boardroom. She spoke of his belief that language was the bridge between souls, and how she had taken that belief and forged it into her sharpest tool. She was not just explaining her fluency, she was explaining her entire existence, the philosophy that had guided her from a grieving daughter to the woman sitting before him now. Jin-woo listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving her face. He was not just hearing her words, he was seeing the story behind them. When she finished, the room was silent again, but it was a comfortable, shared silence. "Your father was a wise man," he said finally, "and he raised a remarkable daughter. The world should not have you hiding in the shadows." He leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. "I do not need a translator, Zola. I need an advisor, a partner, someone who can bridge worlds, not just words. My company is expanding into your home continent. I need someone who understands the currency of your father. I need you." The offer hung in the air, glittering with possibility. It was more than a job. It was a destiny. It was the culmination of a promise made to a ghost in a boardroom years ago. This was the work her father would have wanted for her, the work he had unknowingly been training her for her entire life. There was no hesitation. "I accept," Zola said, the words feeling more true than any she had ever spoken. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversation that was no longer about business, but about everything else, about art and history, and the shared, startling discovery that two people from opposite ends of the earth could have so much in common. When they finally left the restaurant, it was late. The main dining room was empty, the staff quietly cleaning up for the night. Zola walked through the space that had been her prison of invisibility. Her former manager saw her leaving with Mr. Kwan, and his jaw dropped, his face a comic mask of confusion. Zola simply gave him a polite, knowing smile. In the locker room, she changed out of her uniform for the last time. She held the black apron in her hands. It was a simple piece of cloth, slightly frayed at the edges, smelling faintly of lemon polish and bread. It had been her cloak of invisibility, the symbol of a life spent on the margins, of being seen but not perceived. For a moment she thought of throwing it in the trash, an act of angry defiance. But that wasn't her way. Her father had taught her that every stage of life has its own dignity. She folded the apron neatly, with the same care she had shown every single day, and placed it on the bench. A quiet, deliberate farewell. She was not destroying her past. She was simply leaving it behind, complete and concluded. When she stepped out into the cool night air, Jin-woo was waiting for her, standing beside a sleek, dark car that was the epitome of understated elegance. He opened the passenger door for her himself. As she slid into the seat, the scent of new leather replacing the lingering smell of the restaurant, she knew with absolute certainty that she was never going back. The door clicked shut, sealing her in a new world. Zola sat in the quiet of her small apartment, the city lights painting shifting patterns on the wall. The silence here was different. For years, it had been the silence of loneliness, of a life lived in the quiet spaces between other people's loud conversations. Tonight, it was the silence of peace, of a profound and settled rightness. The events of the evening replayed in her mind, not as a chaotic whirlwind, but as a series of clear, logical steps that had led her exactly where she was meant to be. She felt no malice toward Marcus Thorne. He was simply a man blinded by his own reflection, a common enough tragedy. Her triumph wasn't in his defeat, but in her own becoming. She had finally used the key her father had given her, and it had opened the one door that mattered most, the door to her own power. Her gaze fell upon a framed photograph on her bedside table. It was of her and her father, taken on the grounds of a palace in Seoul. He was kneeling down to her level, his arm around her small shoulders, and they were both laughing. She picked it up, her thumb tracing the outline of his smiling face. A wave of grief and love washed over her, so potent it was almost painful. The tears she hadn't shed in the restaurant, the emotion she had kept so tightly controlled, finally came. They were not tears of sadness, but of release, of a victory so long in the making it felt sacred. She pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over her mother's contact. It was impossibly late where her mother lived, but she knew she would answer. She always did. The phone rang twice before her mother's warm, slightly sleepy voice came through the line. "Zola, is everything all right, my dear?" Zola took a shaky breath, steadying herself. "Everything is more than all right, Mama." She didn't need to shout or boast. The story would come later. For now, she just needed to say the most important words. "I got a new job today, a really good one." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Zola knew her mother understood the unspoken weight of her words. "Oh, my sweet girl," her mother whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Zola closed her eyes, clutching the photograph to her chest. I think Papa would be proud," she said, her voice breaking on the last word. "Yes, my love," her mother replied, the sound of her own quiet tears traveling across the continents. "He always was." So the deal was made, not with the thunder of a gavel, but with the quiet click of a closing door. Marcus Thorne received his $50 million prize, but the victory was hollow. He had won the battle, but lost the war, forever marked as a man who had to be saved by his waitress. He became a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms, a symbol of the loud emptiness that so often mistakes itself for power. And Mr. Kwon, or Jinwoo, as Zola came to know him, he found something far more valuable than a corporate acquisition. He found a partner whose worth couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet, a woman who understood that the language of the heart is the only one that truly matters. And Zola, she stepped out of the shadows and into the light. She traded her black apron for tailored suits, her silent servitude for a voice that commanded respect in rooms her father could only have dreamed of entering. Her story is not just about a business deal. It's a fable for our times. It's a testament to the fact that true power is not loud. It is not worn on a wrist or count in a vault. True power is quiet. It is forged in knowledge, tempered by dignity, and wielded through understanding. It is the invisible skill that can change the world in a single spoken sentence. So we ask you, have you ever felt invisible? Have you ever held a strength that the world was too blind to see? We all have a hidden language, a unique key that can unlock the most stubborn of doors. This story is a reminder that you don't need to shout to be heard. If you believe that quiet dignity is the ultimate strength, if you felt a piece of your own story in Zola's victory, then let us know. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their own worth, and subscribe for more tales of unseen heroes finding their voice. What did you think of the choice Zola made? Tell us in the comments below.